They're still finding bodies in the hulk of the Costa Concordia. That brings the official death toll to 12, with 20 people still missing.
In June 1629, a Dutch ship called the Batavia crashed onto a chain of reefs off the coast of Australia. Out of the 340 people on board, nearly 300 survived. And for a brief moment, they thought they had escaped death. But they were wrong. Over the following weeks, more than 100 survivors would be hunted down and ruthlessly killed. Not by pirates, not by enemies, but by the very same people who had survived the shipwreck with them. For nearly 400 years, the story of the Batavia shipwreck sounded too brutal to be real. Then, in the 1950s, archaeologists began uncovering graves and evidence in the exact places where it happened. And what they found confirmed one of the darkest survival stories in maritime history. But to understand how it got that far, we first need to go back to the beginning. A ship already breaking, the ship was called the Batavia, and on October 29, 1628, it set sail from the Netherlands on its very first voyage. It belonged to the Dutch East India Company, better known as the VOC. But calling it a company almost doesn't do it justice. In many ways, it behaved more like a country than a business, and the Batavia was one of its most valuable ships. The plan was to sail from the Netherlands down towards South Africa and then onward to the East Indies. On board were around 340 people: sailors, soldiers, merchants, craftsmen, women, and children. There were expensive trade goods, luxury items, and even huge carved stone blocks that were meant to help build a grand VOC headquarters in Asia. Losing this ship would be a major disaster. But while the cargo was valuable, the people on board were a story of their own. The Batavia was like a floating version of European society. Wealthy officials stayed in comfortable cabins, while sailors and laborers were packed into dark, crowded decks below. And right in the middle of it were three men: Francisco Pelsaert, the senior VOC commander. Intelligent, respected, but seriously ill for much of the voyage. Ariane Jacobus, the ship's skipper and one of the best navigators in the fleet. He was tough, hot-tempered, and he deeply disliked Pelsaert. Then there was Geronimus Cornelis, a junior officer with heavy debts and a troubled past. He was a smooth talker, the kind of man who could convince people of almost anything. Cornelis offered them something dangerous, a different future. Why obey the VOC when they could seize the treasure themselves? Why remain poor when one successful mutiny could make them rich? Slowly, a plan began taking shape. Cornelis and Jacobs started working together. They needed the crew divided and the commander weakened. One night, they attacked a respected female passenger named Lucretia Johns to create outrage and chaos. The hope was that it would trigger a chain of events leading to open rebellion. But something unexpected happened. Pelsaert began investigating. The mutiny plot was suddenly at risk of being exposed before it had even begun. And then, before anyone could make their next move, a white line appeared in the darkness ahead of the ship, and everything changed. When everything fell apart on the night of June 4th, 1629, something appeared in the darkness ahead of the Batavia. A watchman spotted a strange white line stretching across the horizon. He immediately called out a warning, but Captain Jacobs wasn't concerned. He insisted it was only moonlight reflecting on the water. It wasn't. The ship was racing straight toward the Houtman Abrolhos, a chain of sharp coral reefs off the coast of what is now Western Australia. At that time, most Europeans didn't even know this coastline existed. Then came the impact. The Batavia slammed into Morning Reef at full speed. The crash was devastating. The ship's rudder was torn away. Seawater rushed into the lower decks almost immediately. People were crushed before they even understood what was happening. Around 40 people died during the first hours of the disaster. Some drowned trying to reach nearby land. Others were swept away by the powerful surf. The Indian Ocean was slowly tearing the Batavia apart. Over the next several days, survivors were ferried from the wreck to nearby islands. Nearly 300 people managed to escape the sea, but what waited for them wasn't safety. Most ended up on a small island later known as Beacon Island. Under the burning sun, people quickly realized their biggest danger was no longer the sea. It was thirst. Some survivors became so dehydrated that they reportedly drank seawater despite knowing it would only make things worse. And there was another problem. Most of the Batavia's treasure was still out there beneath the waves. The silver chests had sunk close to the wreck, resting among the coral. A few men knew exactly where that fortune was lying. Then, 2 days after the wreck, Commander Pelsaert made a strange decision. He took the ship's only functional longboat, along with Captain Jacobs and dozens of others, and set off to search for fresh water. When they failed to find any on the nearby islands or even the Australian mainland, they made an almost unbelievable decision. They would sail nearly 3,000 kilometers across the Indian Ocean to Batavia, now known as Jakarta, to bring back a rescue ship. On November 15, 1629, Pelsaert and a small group set off in the longboat to make the journey. But none of them knew what was about to unfold behind them in their absence. Rise of Cornelis. The survivors watched their commander's longboat disappear beyond the horizon. And then they waited. 1 day passed, then another. They had no way of knowing that Pelsaert's journey would eventually last 33 days. They didn't know whether he had survived, drowned somewhere in the Indian Ocean, or simply decided not to return. And during that long stretch of uncertainty, a dangerous belief slowly started to take hold among them. From where they stood, it looked as if the commander, the captain, and many of the most experienced men had taken the only reliable boat and abandoned everyone else to their fate. That belief changed everything. The rules that had governed life aboard the Batavia suddenly seemed meaningless. And in that growing chaos and fear, a man who had already been waiting for something like this quietly stepped forward, Hieronymus Cornelis. Technically, he was now the highest-ranking VOC official left on the islands. But rank alone wasn't what gave him power. Cornelis was educated, confident, and remarkably persuasive. While many survivors were frightened, he presented himself as the one who could organize food, water, and survival. So, people listened to him. But behind that calm exterior, Cornelis was facing a problem that nobody else understood. As we know, he had already been involved in a mutiny plot before the disaster. So if Pelsaert somehow reached Batavia and returned with a rescue ship, that secret would not stay buried for long. And if it came out, Cornelis would almost certainly be executed. The more he thought about it, the clearer the situation became. A rescue ship wasn't his salvation. It was his death sentence. So he began preparing for a completely different future. He gathered a small inner circle around himself. Not the most trustworthy survivors, but the most loyal and easiest to control. Then he started taking command of everything that mattered. The survivors lost the ability to defend themselves, feed themselves, or leave the islands without permission. Because now, everything was controlled by Cornelis. But that wasn't the most dangerous part. As he looked at the limited supplies and the hundreds of people still alive, he arrived at a chilling conclusion. In his mind, there were simply too many survivors. And to solve that problem, he came up with a solution so brutal, it would turn this disaster story into something far darker than a shipwreck alone. The controlled killings. By this point, Cornelis already controlled the two most important things on the islands, water and food. Now came the next step: control the people themselves. He began dividing survivors into groups and forcing them onto rafts. He sent them to nearby islands under the excuse that they were searching for water and food. It sounded like survival planning. It even sounded reasonable in a place where water was running out. But the truth was very different. Because the islands he chose were even more lifeless than Beacon Island itself. People sent there were actually being abandoned without being told. On Beacon Island, Cornelis tightened his grip further. Armed mutineers guarded the water supplies. Every ration became a weapon. Obedience meant survival. Disobedience meant thirst. And thirst, in that heat, quickly broke people down. Then the killings began. At first, they were made to look accidental. Sick or unwanted survivors were loaded onto boats with claims of relocation. But during the journey, the guards would throw them into the sea and come back, calmly saying they were accidents. But soon, even that excuse disappeared. Night raids started. Men entered sleeping tents, dragged people out, and killed them with knives or clubs. Bodies were thrown into the ocean so that the tide could erase all trace by morning. Women were not spared. Some were taken alive instead of killed. They were forced into Cornelis's control, abused, and used as a way to show complete dominance over the island. Then, something even more disturbing happened. The killings stopped feeling like events. They became routine, even competitive. Some mutineers began treating it like a test of loyalty, comparing how quickly or cleanly they could kill. The island was no longer just survival. It was controlled elimination. And through this elimination, nearly 125 survivors had been killed. But then came a problem. Somewhere on another island nearby, something was beginning to form that Cornelis had not yet taken seriously. Island that fought back. Among the survivors, the biggest threat Cornelis faced was the soldiers, and he had already planned how to remove them. He sent about 20 trained men, led by Weeb Hayes, to a nearby island called West Wallaby. On paper, it was a search for water and supplies. In reality, it was a death sentence. Cornelis stripped them completely. He fully expected them to starve and die there. But something went wrong. Very wrong. West Wallaby Island was different. It had hidden fresh water sources beneath the ground and far more life than the other islands. Meanwhile, Beacon Island was falling apart under thirst, hunger, and fear. Then came the signal, smoke rising from West Wallaby. Cornelis saw it and understood immediately. The plan had failed. The men he tried to eliminate were not only alive, they were thriving. And worse, they were now completely independent. Soon after, terrified survivors began escaping Beacon Island. At night, some slipped into the water on floating wood and swam across dangerous channels to reach Hayes' Island. They didn't just bring themselves, they brought the truth about Beacon Island. The killings, the night raids, the executions in tents, and the system Cornelis had built. Hayes and his men immediately prepared. They also built weapons from wreckage, heavy wooden clubs reinforced with iron spikes pulled from the ship. Then the first attack came. Cornelis sent armed mutineers across the water, expecting an easy massacre. Instead, they met resistance. Hayes' men fought as one group, using heavy clubs to push them back in the shallow surf. Even with swords, the mutineers were beaten and forced to retreat in panic. Cornelis had lost control of the force, and that meant danger, real danger. Because if they survived, everything he had done could collapse. So he didn't rely on violence this time. He went for something else, something far more deceptive. The trap of trust. Cornelis knew he couldn't defeat Wiebe Hayes by open fighting anymore, so instead, he requested a peace meeting. It looked like a shift from violence to negotiation, but it was never peace. Hidden behind this gesture was a second plan. While Cornelis spoke openly, a separate group of his most brutal mutineers, led by Wouter Loos, prepared to secretly enter Hayes's camp. Their mission was simple: kill Hayes, break his leadership, and corrupt his men with promises of silver. It was meant to collapse the resistance from the inside. But Hayes was not fooled. He allowed Cornelis into his camp anyway, and waited. The moment Cornelis began his smooth speech, the trap reversed. Hayes's men were struck instantly. The mutineers were overwhelmed in seconds. Several of Cornelis's closest men were killed on the spot. Cornelis himself was thrown down, bound tightly in ropes. In one move, the entire command structure behind the mutiny collapsed. But the danger didn't end there. Back on the islands, Wouter Loos took control of the remaining mutineers. They still had muskets, swords, and gunpowder. And now, with their leader captured, they decided to attack with everything they had. They launched a final assault on Hayes's stone fort. The mutineers fired their guns and rushed forward, trying to break through the walls. It turned into a brutal final fight, with Hayes's men defending their fort, and the mutineers attacking with desperation to overpower them. And then, something impossible happened. A sail appeared on the horizon. Had returned. Commander Francisco Pelsayert had survived the 33-day voyage to Batavia and come back with help. In an instant, the entire battle changed. It was no longer just survival or revenge. It became a race. Because whoever reached the Sire first would decide everything. The truth, the story, the fate of everyone on those islands. The mutineers had one plan: reach the ship first, pose as survivors, seize control, kill Pelsayert, and escape with the treasure. Hayes had the opposite goal: reach it first and reveal everything before the deception began. Both sides ran for their boats. The mutineers launched fast, experienced crews into the water. Hayes and a few men jumped into a rough makeshift boat and began rowing with pure force, driven by exhaustion, survival, and urgency. And in the middle of chaos, Cornelis, now a prisoner, watched it all break apart, stripped of control, stripped of authority, and begging for things he could no longer change. Everything now depended on one final moment. Who would reach the commander's ship first? The final reckoning. The race to the commander's ship was brutal, but Wiebe Hayes and his men reached first. And when Commander Francisco Pelsayert finally heard what had happened on those islands, he was shocked beyond belief. Hundreds stranded. A mutiny, a calculated system of killings, a leader who had turned survival into execution. And now, with authority back in his hands, he acted in the way that was common in the 1600s 50C world: fast, strict, and extremely harsh. He ordered 3 kinds of punishment for the mutineers. The main leader, Geronimus Cornelis, was sentenced to be executed. His punishment was especially brutal. He was hanged, and before that, both of his hands were cut off as a warning to others. Several of the worst mutineers were also executed. Others were left behind on the Australian mainland, deliberately marooned, becoming some of the first recorded Europeans to be left stranded on that continent. After that, Pelsayert gathered the remaining survivors from the islands and the wreck site. Around 300 people had originally survived the disaster, but only 86 made it through everything that followed. He organized their transport and took them back toward Batavia. On November 15, 1629, the Sayardam pulled up its anchor and officially left the Houtman Abrolhos Islands. And then, the story slowly disappeared from public attention. For nearly 3 centuries, it survived mostly as written records and ship logs, a strange, almost unbelievable tale of shipwreck, survival, and mass murder that many people found hard to fully accept. Until 1963. That's when divers finally located the wreck of the Batavia on Morning Reef, exactly where the old Dutch records said it would be. Then they turned to the islands, and there they found the truth in the ground. Mass graves on Beacon Island, skeletons of men, women, and children. Many showed cut marks, crushed skulls, and clear signs of violent death. The physical evidence matched the old journals almost exactly. It confirmed what had been written centuries earlier. This wasn't just a story. It really happened. And that makes it one of the most disturbing and unforgettable survival stories ever recorded in human history. Today, nearly 400 years later, a bronze statue of Wiebe Hayes stands on the Geraldton foreshore in Western Australia. For the world, he will always be remembered as the man who helped stop one of the darkest survival stories in maritime history. So this was the story of the Batavia ship and the absolute hell that unfolded there. In the end, only 86 of those passengers made it back home. The rest never left those islands alive. They still lie buried under the sand and hidden beneath the waters. Now, what do you think about this entire story, and what would you like to add to it? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you liked this video, give it a thumbs up. And if you want to watch more dark, real, and mysterious stories like this, subscribe to the channel. We'll see you in the next one.